Okay, today we're going to talk about uh, why does the church require celibacy and for priests, and did Paul challenge Peter's authority? So let's go over here and bring in the slideshow. Okay, why does the church require celibacy for priests? So there's several arguments against it. Uh, Nowadays, people think celibacy is impossible. Everybody for a man to be celibate through his life is extraordinary. Uh, Supposedly, the Catholic Church has a hatred of sex and was rejecting marriage, that everybody should be celibate and virginal and so forth. And of course, our culture now thinks everyone needs sex. Free sex is fairly rampant. There's more people that are uh, having children that aren't married, more people just living together than ever before. So sex is pretty rampant. Also, they said, well, the apostles were married. Why can't the priests be married nowadays? And that's true. The apostles were married. But there's some tradition that after they started their evangelization, they became celibate, even though they were still married. And maybe another argument against maybe the church was just worried about the church property and who was going to upkeep the family. And then there's a whole thing about the devil wants to depopulate the world. So instead of go and multiply, as in the Bible, the church wanted to stop that. So in later times, according to First Timothy, Paul said that there'll be some uh, ramifications to our lives, and that the church will come in and forbid marriage, and this would be kind of an end times thing. And thus, if the church forbid marriage, it would be against the Bible. But Paul is really talking about a distraction from the spiritual life, and this could happen. But if the church did that, then that certainly would be against the doctrine and dogma of the church. Where if, like, somebody says they have 6 kids, you might just assume they're Catholic, as I did the other night when talking to another soccer referee, and he was. And of course, Paul was celibate and considered celibacy as a higher vocation. And of course, Jesus is celibate, and he says some are incapable of marriage because they were born so, some because they were made so by others, and some because they have renounced marriage for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So whoever can accept this ought to accept it, so he was really saying that celibacy is more the way to go than to marriage. And of course, it is uh, an act that that would be honored. To be celibate or to be virgin was definitely a higher honor from the saints and than just a regular person that had a marriage. Of course, the early church, there was no requirement, but over a period of time, celibacy evolved as more priests chose celibacy. And that was part of because priests were assigned to parishes, but then they were asked to go to different towns and make presentations, and they had to have a circuit. There wasn't so much of one church in one town. It would be like houses here and there that they would move to. And also there were priests that were requested to go around and preach at different places. So, they would have to leave their family alone for months at a time. Uh, in the fourth century, the 300s, they started requiring priests to be celibate. And in the 11th century, there was a monastic influence from the monks and so forth that chose celibacy and talked about it, and it became popular with the priest to be a priest and a monk to be celibate. And then in the 12th century, uh, celibacy was required for all clergy, and this was done in the First Lateran Council. And of course, this was for the West, the Latin Church, as opposed to the Eastern Church. So, in practical matters, when a priest, if he was married, when he died, you'd have to have some type of compensation or whatever for the wife and children. And how would that work out? They would have to, leave whatever he had with the church to the church and leave some of it back to the family. So that would be a kind of a not a great thing, as far as wills go and how they're always getting disputed. Of course, there was the huge domestic distractions. If a priest had a family, he's got a congregation, he's got a family. So what comes first? I would think typically the family would come first. And, it's hard enough being a parent besides trying to be the leader of your congregation and listen to those people and their wants and needs. And, of course, finances, the congregation would have to, instead of supporting one person, the priest, and supporting the church and all its costs, they would also have to have a separate house, a larger house, and pay for the upkeep of the wife and the kids. And then, of course, back then there were a lot of kids. Family of 6, family of 10 wasn't that uncommon. So that's a lot of bucks going out to keep the priest running in the congregation as opposed to one priest. And of course, nowadays, a priest might make $1,500 a month, $2,000 a month. So he gets very little as far as a check every month. So it's a lot easier to finance a priest than to finance a family, obviously. But it fixed problems, as you see above. There would be maybe a few more priests, but you'd have all the problems we just went over above with married priests. And then, you could have divorces coming in, and then you'd really have problems with who gets what in the priests and family problems. Babies that are in the hospital, the priest wouldn't be available, kids with problems, trying to get a kid into college. So there are probably a lot more problems with having a married priest, even though you might have a few more, but there'd be a lot more problems. And right now, a priest is pretty much available to move anytime, and they would like to move the priest every several years so that the congregation doesn't get attached to that priest rather than the priest acting as a Christ-like figure and kind of just part of the church, part of the whole church, and not specifically for that congregation, and especially specifically for certain families or whatever in the church, in the congregation that might start having difficulties where some families begin to rule because they're friends of the priests and so forth. So also the celibate priest makes an eschatological witness as a sign of contradiction. He's not concerned with this world. He's there to help his congregation, to say mass. He's concerned with the spiritual life and not so much with this world. He must pray a lot. So he's really a contradiction to what we have now in our society, where we're trying to keep up with the bills, what's going on in society and politics and all that. So uh, he is a sign of the contradiction between living for the world and living for the future. So as you know, no one is married in heaven. So the priest is really living in the future, that uh, although you will know your wife or husband in heaven, you won't be married because there's no reason to have relations there, because you won't be having children. And celibacy is not a doctrine. So the church has a right to legislate to change whatever it means, as it did when it started bringing Anglican priests in who were married. And so the priesthood, the celibacy is a choice. So when they start to think about becoming a priest, they know that they would have to be celibate. And in the Latin Rite, you must choose celibacy. And in the Eastern Rite, allows for married priests, although if their wife dies, they may not remarry, and bishops must be celibate. Uh, so you have the personal ordinate of the Chair of St. Peter, which is basically the Anglican priests who have come over and joined the Catholic Church away from the Anglican Church. And it's kind of a diocese, a national diocese for all the Anglican priests under this ordinance. And you had the Amazon Synod, where they were talking about down in Brazil, in the Amazon, they needed more priests. It was hard to get priests there. And that maybe if they allowed priests to be married, they would have more priests again, and that was considered. But as we saw in the previous slide, there's a lot more rock and roll that goes on with having a married priest and supporting a family. So I think the problems would much outweigh not having enough priests. Priests are very loving. They have to love their whole family, their whole congregation. Uh, and just because you're a priest doesn't mean you don't know about family problems. Just like I say, you don't have, the doctor doesn't have to have cancer to know how to help people with cancer. You know, a priest hears a lot of different stories about marriages, a lot. So he's trained in that. He hears it, so he knows what's going on. It's not something that he hasn't heard before. So he can help with marriages even though he's not married. And you know, the priests get lonely. I would think there are priests that say have they're the only priests in the parish. Well, they would find other priests to go out to eat, to play golf, to get together, and of course they have their congregation. And there's usually several families that invite the priests over for dinner or bring the priests dinner. You know, I hear our priest say, "Yeah, he gets food all the time from people." Any questions? So we're going to talk about, did Paul challenge Peter's authority? So this comes up when Paul says in Galatians 2-11, when Peter came to Antioch, St. Paul told the Galatians, I opposed him to his face because he clearly was wrong. And it goes on, he said, for he used to eat with the Gentiles, but when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. So those were the Jewish leaders that came in who still believed that you should follow the Mosaic rites, and you could not eat with Gentiles. You had to eat at a separate table, a separate time. And then the other Jews around Peter started joining him in this hypocrisy. So even Barnabas was led astray. So Paul says, when I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, also with what they declared at the Council of Jerusalem, where they said you had no longer had to follow the Mosaic rites. I told Cephas in front of them all, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and have been living like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? How come you changed? So he said that he rebuked St. Peter in person when Peter lapsed into practices contrary to the truth of the Gospels. So in the non-Catholic view, some people look at this and say, Paul rebuked Peter, thus Paul was challenging the authority of Peter. But Peter, as a rock, had no position, so Peter wasn't really the head of the church, and that popes really have no line of succession. Of course, this goes contrary to what we read in the Gospels, where Jesus told Peter, he's the rock, and on this rock I'll build my church. And some people say, well, it's Petra and Petros and all that, words that are in the Greek, but Jesus was speaking in Aramaic. So he would have said, you are Cephas, and upon this Cephas I will build my church. So, and then also he gave Peter the keys to the kingdom, which goes back to the Old Testament, where the king's right-hand man was given the keys, and in that those keys would go on to the successor of that right-hand man. Of course, Paul recognized Peter's authority. He even said he came to Jerusalem to meet with Peter, and then Peter gave him acknowledged his what Paul was preaching, and said that he gave Paul his right hand to show that Paul was recognized for what he was teaching. But then again, Paul recognized Peter as the authority. So Paul rebuked Peter for hypocrisy, not challenging Peter's authority. Of course, people make mistakes all the time, and Peter made a mistake, but that doesn't mean he didn't have authority or still didn't have authority. And the Bible has a history of rebuking decadent clerics. And then also you have Nathan goes to King David and said, you took Bathsheba, you took someone else's wife, and you had her husband killed. And of course, David repented, but even when he's repented and forgiven, he still has to pay a penalty, a penance, which was Bathsheba's, their firstborn was died. So if a rebuke is not necessary if Peter wasn't a leader. So if the rebuke is public, Peter's actions could do harm to the rest of the Gentiles and to the faith. So rebuking him in public was good, but it didn't undermine Peter's authority. Again, you can say someone in authority is doing something wrong, but they're still the president or the governor or whatever. Everybody does, everybody screws up sometime. And then Paul considered himself least of the apostles. Any questions? So that's it for this week. Next week, we'll talk about why does the church follow so many traditions, and why does the church have bishops? So we'll go over these two things next week. So have a blessed week, and see you next week.